Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland, and here I am at the last resting place of Aldous Huxley. Surprisingly modest, rather disappointing, and what a sorrowful state it's in. Look at that, in very poor condition, and it seems in a few decades' time it won't even be legible. So Aldous Huxley, where can we see him down there? Aldous Leonard Huxley, 1893 to 1963, there it is, about him, and various other relatives of his buried in this family grave, or should I say vault. But what of Aldous Huxley? Well, he was born at Godalming in the United Kingdom, which is just a couple of miles away from this graveyard, and he was born into a most distinguished family. So his grandfather was Thomas Huxley, known as Darwin's bulldog, who was always vociferating in favour of evolution and saying that creation was absolute bunkum. And bear in mind, in the 1860s when he was having these arguments, he was well ahead of his time. A lot of men of science had not accepted evolution back then. Bear in mind that scientists were almost exclusively male in the 19th century. But anyway, Aldous Huxley's father, he taught at Charterhouse School, which is quite close by. So there were plenty of books in the house, and they were better off than most people, but they weren't rich. And on his mother's side, his great uncle was the poet Matthew Arnold, and his great granduncle was Thomas Arnold, the headmaster of Rugby School. So he grew up in this very intellectual ambiance. Two of his brothers became very eminent scientists. One of his brothers committed suicide in the First World War because he was mentally ill. Anyway, so Aldous Huxley went to Eton. I'm pretty sure he got a King's Scholarship, and he was happy there, very academical, the rest of it, not that into sport, but always took exercise, always slender. And then he went up to Balliol College, Oxford, and Balliol was becoming one of the colleges of greatest stature in Oxford at the time, because Benjamin Jowett had been master of that college, had really put it on the map as a grand college, because until the late 19th century it was thought to be not especially distinguished, even though it was one of the oldest ones. Anyway, so he went there, and I'm not sure what he was reading. Was it French? Certainly he was very much into English literature, and that was when, I can't remember who said it, that English literature is what a gentleman studies in his spare time, because his schooling had been mostly about knocking a bit of classics into him, but he didn't need that much of it knocked into him since he was very able and diligent. So he graduated from there, unsure what to do with himself. He had thought of reading medicine, but then he discovered very poor eyesight, which ruled out qualifying as a doctor, because obviously you need to be able to see quite well these days, even as a doctor, but back then they didn't have such good glasses or any sort of treatments, and his eyesight was to dog in the rest of his days. So to various other things, he'd fallen in with the Bloomsbury set, as in name for Bloomsbury Square in London. The Bloomsbury set was this informal circle of left-wing intellectuals and artists like George Bernard Shaw, John Maynard Keynes, Virginia Woolf, many others. And so he was on the edge of them. They often met at Garsington, which is just outside Oxford, an estate owned by Lady Ottoline Morrell. And the chatelaine had him working as a farm labourer sometimes, which he did not consider beneath his station in life. And bear in mind, he was just so far ahead of most people educationally, because this is the time of the First World War. He'd been turned down for military service because of his myopia. This was the time when most people left school at the age of 12. And he got into writing. He'd written his first novel at 17, eventually got it published. He published a number of well-received novels. He's best known for Brave New World, the title of which is taken from The Tempest by Shakespeare. And it's a vision of a future where the government uses hypnosis and various drugs for mind control. So it's a dystopian novel about a totalitarian state. He briefly taught French at Eton, but he was unable to maintain discipline in class, and apparently he was rather second-rate teacher. He taught George Orwell, who was also a King's Scholar, just a few years younger than him, well, about 9 years younger than him, but Orwell actually really didn't rate Aldous Huxley, even though by everyone's agreement, he had absolute command of the French language. So he gave up being a beak at Eton, and really got into writing. He was scintillated by Hinduism, Upanishads, Vedanta, Hinduism, Buddhism a little bit, any esoteric religions, philosophy generally, and he felt that there was more common ground between Oriental philosophies and faiths and Western ones that was generally realized. So he published books on this, like Point, Counterpoint. Anyway, he got married to a Belgian lady shortly after the First World War, Maria Nice, and they had one child. So they then emigrated to the United States, and they settled in California. So he's to live in Los Angeles for the rest of his life, and he eventually became a pacifist. He'd been horrified for the First World War. So many of his friends had been killed in the First World War, others wounded, scarred for life, bearing emotional scars, not physical scars, with facial tics, flashbacks, and so on. What we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, to wake up shrieking in terror in the middle of the night and things like that. So he never wanted that to happen again. He was curiously apolitical. Bear in mind, he grew up when politics was really in ferment. He'd seen the upheaval occasioned by the First World War, the Bolshevik Revolution, the National Strike, the decline of the Liberal Party, the rise of the Labour Party, and so on, and then obviously communism, Nazism, and so on. But he was largely indifferent to these controversies. He was interested in things which are more abstruse and abstract than politics. He later applied for American citizenship, but he was turned down on the grounds that he would refuse to bear arms in defense of the United States because of his pacifist beliefs, and he didn't give a religious ground for refusing to kill. So his wife died in 1955, and he married an American next year, which guaranteed his right to stay in the United States. So that Brave New World, which I mentioned, in some ways it's a source for 1984, which his pupil George Orwell, or Eric Blair, KS as he was known, wrote some years later. So he was a very well-known intellectual, even though he never actually had an academic position, Aldous Huxley. Anyway, so he was suffering from laryngeal cancer in the late 1950s, and he was very worried about the way the world was going. He felt that we were pullulating over much, and there was going to be fighting for resources, that governments were going to find new techniques of mind control. He began to experiment with various drugs, psychotropic drugs and others, what we now call acid, LSD, looking back to some of these ancient philosophies, even of Egypt, which were to a large extent inspired by experimentation with such mind-bending substances. The Doors of Perception is his really record of his mental experiments based on what he could do having used these various drugs. The Doors of Perception is a quotation from William Blake about when the doors of perception are opened, all becomes clear, something like that. The Doors, that Californian band, came a little bit later on, but Jim Morrison was the front man thereof, and they took their name, The Doors, from that as well, the Doors of Perception. So he felt he could expand his mind and perceive new things. He was a bit ahead of his time. In some ways, he's a prophet of the counterculture of the 1960s, but he didn't live to see it. So because he succumbed to laryngeal cancer on, if memory serves, the 21st of November 1963, being the very day that John F. Kennedy was shot, and indeed C.S. Lewis left this earth. So he would have been front page news, there would have been all these obituaries, but he's pushed right to the back pages by the assassination of the American president. So he's brought back here to be laid to rest with his family. So that is him. You can see some videos on YouTube of him talking about his hopes and fears for the future. So that's it. I hope enough about Aldous Huxley, an absolutely scintillating historical figure, and I would highly recommend that you dip into his works. Look at that huge mausoleum behind. I originally thought he was buried in that one, but no, he isn't. And what a shame that he doesn't have a finer grave, or people don't clean it, so it'll be very legible. Here he is with, I guess, his brother Noel, who committed suicide, and then Leonard Huxley, who's his father. And then there's a name I can't even read. Someone, his wife, must be Anne Maria, his wife, his first wife, Julian Sorrell. I'm guessing that's his brother. Oh yeah. Oh, and this is his second wife as well, Marie Juliette née Balliot. That's the American lady he married. And then yeah, Auntie Julian Huxley, their son. As in son of which one? And Rosalind. And what does it say around here? Daughter of Thomas Arnold. Oh, it says something about daughter of Thomas Arnold. Yeah. Well, Thomas Arnold was the headmaster of rugby. And what else does it say? Julia Frances Huxley. So here they are, because you see there's this path they've got. It's quite steep to be carrying a coffin up. And you see this thing here, this little wall, because I wonder if it's more like a vault or something. Live by domination, hope and love. Admiration, hope and love. So there we are. Well, I think it's a shame. I think he deserves so much more. He was almost an epoch-making thinker who's largely unremembered these days. So I sincerely hope you appreciated this, and will do so in a pecuniary sense, because, you know, filthy lucre makes the world go round. So kindly cross my PayPal account with some silver, georgecallahan79@gmail.com. is all lowercase letters. George Callahan spelled George, Callahan, Callaghan. So I urgently need donations to sustain the channel, and you can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and so forth. All right, toodaloo.